My name is Marlene, and am 34 years old. Last Thanksgiving, I stood in my parents' kitchen in suburban Ohio and watched my two children, my son Dexter, who's 8, and my daughter Faye, who's 6, staring at empty plates while my sister Gretchen's 3 kids laughed and stuffed their faces with turkey and mashed potatoes at the dining table. My mother Dorothea smiled at them and then turned to my babies and said those words I'll never forget. Just wait a little longer, sweethearts. You can eat after your cousins finish. My husband Wade looked at me with absolute disbelief, and I felt my blood boiling, but I stayed silent, swallowing the rage building in my chest. That was the moment I realized my own family had been treating my children like second-class citizens for years, and I was done being quiet. Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you've ever dealt with family favoritism, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this story gets intense, and you won't want to miss how I finally stood up to the people who were supposed to love my kids unconditionally. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare really started. Standing in that kitchen, watching my children's faces fall as they realized once again they weren't good enough for their own grandparents, I felt 3 years of memories come crashing down on me like a tidal wave. This wasn't the first time, not even close. And suddenly I could see the entire pattern laid out before me like a roadmap of rejection and favoritism that had been too blind or too afraid to acknowledge. The first major incident happened 2 Christmases ago when we all gathered at my parents' house for the holiday morning gift exchange. Gretchen's kids tore through mountains of expensive presents, brand new iPads with protective cases, designer clothes from stores I couldn't afford to walk into, remote control cars that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My kids sat on the floor with their modest pile and unwrapped cheap dollar store toys, plastic action figures that broke within hours, coloring books with crayons that snapped the moment they touched paper. When I pulled my mother aside and asked her about the obvious disparity, she put her hand on my shoulder with that condescending smile and said, "Gretchen is struggling as a single mom, sweetheart. We wanted to help her out. You understand, don't you?" And like a fool, I nodded and swallowed my hurt and told myself I was being petty for caring about material things. Then came last summer's family vacation to a lake house my parents rented for a week in Michigan. Gretchen's 3 children got the massive upstairs bedroom with custom bunk beds, a flat-screen television mounted on the wall, and windows that overlooked the beautiful lake with morning sun streaming through gauzy curtains. My kids were told they'd be sleeping on a pull-out couch in the living room where people walked through at all hours, where the kitchen light stayed on late into the night, where they had 0 privacy and 0 consideration. When I finally worked up the courage to complain to my father Hubert, he looked at me like I'd just asked him for a kidney and said in that dismissive tone he'd perfected over the years, "Stop being selfish, Marlene. Your sister needs our support right now. Can't you think about someone other than yourself for once?" I felt about 2 inches tall, like I was a child again being scolded for wanting something as simple as fairness. The third pattern that should have opened my eyes involved birthday parties. Every single year, Gretchen's kids got massive celebrations with rented bounce houses set up in my parents' backyard, professional magicians performing tricks, expensive custom cakes from the fancy bakery downtown with 3 tiers and fondant decorations. My children got small gatherings at our modest home with homemade cake. I stayed up late baking, party games. I created myself because I couldn't afford entertainment. And my mother Dorothea would always say the same thing when I mentioned the inequality. "You're doing fine financially, Marlene. You have a good job and a husband who works. You don't need our help like Gretchen does." For 3 solid years, I swallowed every bit of anger, pushed down every flash of resentment, convinced myself I was being the bigger person, by understanding that my sister was struggling and my parents were just trying to help her. I told myself that being generous meant accepting less, that being mature meant not making waves, that being a good daughter meant letting my own children suffer so that my sister's children could thrive. But that Thanksgiving dinner was different somehow. Maybe because the favoritism was so blatant, so public, so impossible to rationalize away. My husband Wade had been telling me for months. Every time we drove home from my parents' house with sad kids in the back seat, "They're treating you like garbage, Marlene. They're damaging our children. Stand up for yourself before it's too late." I always made excuses, always found reasons to justify their behavior, always convinced myself that keeping the peace was more important than demanding respect. What Wade didn't know, what I'd hidden from everyone, including myself, was that I had actually been the family breadwinner for years and had contributed significantly to my parents' well-being. 2 years ago, when my father Hubert needed emergency heart surgery and the insurance didn't cover everything, I was the one who stepped up and paid $15,000 from my savings to make sure he got the best care possible. I worked overtime for 6 months to rebuild that savings account, sacrificing time with my own children so my father could live. Yet somehow, someway, Gretchen, who had never contributed a single dollar to anyone's welfare, who had never offered to help with anything beyond showing up for free meals, was treated like royalty, while I was treated like the help. The damage this favoritism had done to my children became impossible to ignore anymore. Dexter, my sweet, sensitive boy who used to be outgoing and confident, had become withdrawn at school according to his teacher, who called me in for a conference. She said he sat alone at lunch, didn't raise his hand in class anymore, seemed sad all the time. When I asked him about it, he finally broke down crying and told me he felt like he wasn't good enough, like something was wrong with him because even his own grandparents didn't seem to love him as much as they loved his cousins. My daughter Faye, who was only 6 years old and should have been carefree and happy, cried every single time we drove to my parents' house, asking me the question that broke my heart into pieces. Mama, why don't Grandma and Grandpa love us like they love Gretchen's kids? Are we bad? Did we do something wrong? I would hold her and tell her she was perfect and loved, but my words rang hollow because my actions showed her something different. By continuing to subject her to that environment, by continuing to accept that treatment, I was teaching her that she didn't deserve better, that she should accept crumbs and be grateful for them. Standing in that kitchen watching my babies wait for leftovers while other children feasted, I made a silent vow that echoed through every cell in my body. This ends today, I told myself. No more excuses, no more rationalizations, no more protecting people who were hurting my children. This ends right now. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, watching Gretchen's children pile their plates so high with turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes that food literally spilled over the edges onto the tablecloth my mother had carefully ironed that morning. My sister Gretchen sat at the head of the table in the spot usually reserved for my father, scrolling through her phone with her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen, not even looking up to acknowledge that 2 small children were standing in the kitchen with empty stomachs and crushed spirits. She didn't tell her kids to share, didn't suggest they make room at the table, didn't even seem to register that something deeply wrong was happening right in front of her face. I walked slowly toward my mother, who was pulling another pan of rolls from the oven, and I kept my voice low and steady even though everything inside me was screaming. "Mom," I said quietly, "why are my kids not eating right now?" Dorothea turned to me with that practiced expression of mild annoyance she always wore when I questioned anything, and she set the hot pan down on the stovetop with more force than necessary. "There's only so much food, Marlene," she said in a tone you'd use with a particularly slow child. "We made sure the little ones ate first. Your kids can wait their turn. They'll be fine." The words hit me like a physical slap, and I felt Wade tense up beside me where he'd been standing silently observing everything. "My kids are little ones, Mom," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. "Dexter is 8 years old. Faye is 6. They're smaller than 2 of Gretchen's kids." "What are you talking about?" My mother's face flushed red and she waved her hand dismissively like she was shooing away a mosquito. "Don't be so dramatic about everything, Marlene. Good Lord, you always make such a big deal out of nothing. There'll be plenty of leftovers for them to eat. They won't starve in the next 20 minutes. Before I could respond, my father Hubert walked into the kitchen carrying his empty beer bottle, and he immediately picked up on the tension crackling in the air between us. "What's going on in here?" he asked, looking between me and my mother. "Why does everyone look upset? It's Thanksgiving." My mother jumped in before I could speak, turning to him with exasperation written all over her face. "Your daughter is complaining because we fed the children first," she said, emphasizing the word children like my kids didn't qualify. "I told her there's plenty of food and hers can eat in a few minutes, but apparently that's not good enough." My father sighed heavily and looked at me with disappointment. The same expression had given me 1,000 times throughout my life whenever I dared to ask for anything or express any need. "Marlene, your sister is going through a very hard time right now," he said slowly, like he was explaining basic arithmetic. "She's raising 3 kids alone with no help. Can't you be a little more understanding and patient? Is that really too much to ask? Something inside me snapped in that moment, something that had been bending and bending for years under the weight of their expectations and their favoritism and their complete disregard for my feelings or my children's well-being. I have been understanding for 3 years, I said loudly, no longer caring who heard me. I have been patient and generous, and I have watched you treat my children like they matter less than Gretchen's children over and over again, and I am done. I am completely done. I turned toward the doorway and called out, Dexter, Faye, go get your coats right now. We're leaving. The dining room went silent, and I could feel multiple pairs of eyes staring at me. Gretchen finally looked up from her phone, her perfectly shaped eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Oh, here we go, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Drama queen Marlene making everything about herself again. Some things never change. That comment was the match that lit the powder keg, and suddenly I was walking into the dining room where everyone sat frozen with forks halfway to their mouths. Drama queen, I repeated, my voice shaking with rage. You want to talk about drama, Gretchen? Let's talk about how your kids get iPads for Christmas while mine get dollar store junk. Let's talk about how your kids get the master bedroom on family vacations while mine sleep on a couch in the hallway. Let's talk about how you get professional birthday parties while my kids get homemade cake and games I create myself. Let's talk about how today, right now, your kids are stuffing their faces while my 6-year-old daughter stands in the kitchen waiting for scraps like a dog. Gretchen's face went from smug to furious in seconds, and she stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. How dare you, she hissed. I'm a single mother, Marlene. I need help. I don't have a husband with a good job. I don't have the luxury of turning down support from my family. But of course you're too selfish to understand that because everything has always come easy for you. I actually laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that surprised even me. Easy for me, I shouted. Are you kidding me right now? I work 2 jobs, Gretchen. 2 jobs. I work at the dental clinic full-time, and I do bookkeeping on weekends to make ends meet while you sit at home collecting sympathy and handouts. I paid for Dad's heart surgery. I contributed to the family emergency fund. I have helped this family financially more than you ever have. But somehow, I'm the selfish one because I don't want to watch my children be treated like second-class citizens in their own family. My mother, Dorothea, rushed into the dining room with my father right behind her, and she pointed her finger at me like I was a misbehaving teenager. How dare you speak to your sister that way, she said, her voice shrill and angry. How dare you come into our home and cause this kind of scene on a holiday? You should be ashamed of yourself. Wade, who had been watching everything with his jaw clenched, finally stepped forward and put his hand on my shoulder. How dare you treat your grandchildren like they don't matter? He said directly to my mother, his voice cold and controlled. How dare you let them stand there hungry while other kids eat? What kind of grandmother does that? The room erupted into chaos with multiple people yelling over each other, voices rising and overlapping until it was just noise and anger and years of resentment pouring out all at once. My Uncle Randall, my father's brother who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, stood up and tried to play peacemaker. Everyone calm down, he said loudly. This is family. We don't treat each other this way. Marlene, I think you're overreacting a bit here. Your parents are just trying to help where help is needed most. I turned to him with disbelief. So my children don't need help, I asked. My children don't deserve to be treated equally? They should just accept whatever crumbs fall from the table and be grateful. My Aunt Celeste, my mother's younger sister who had been silent throughout dinner, suddenly spoke up from her seat. I've noticed this too, she said quietly, looking at my mother. For years I've watched you favor Gretchen's children over Marlene's. And honestly, Dorothea, it's wrong. It's been wrong for a long time. My mother whirled on her own sister with fury in her eyes. You stay out of this, Celeste. This is none of your business. I grabbed Dexter's hand and Faye's hand. Both of them were crying now, with Faye sobbing openly, and Dexter trying to be brave but with tears streaming down his face anyway. We're leaving, I said firmly, moving toward the front door where our coats hung on hooks. Don't bother calling us. Don't bother texting. We're done. Gretchen followed us into the hallway, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, please. You'll be back next week apologizing like you always do. You can't stay away because you need Mom and Dad just like everyone else. I turned to face her one last time, my children pressed against my sides. "Watch me," I said quietly. As we walked out the front door into the cold November evening, I could hear my mother crying dramatically, my father's voice raised in anger, multiple people talking over each other trying to assign blame. Wade wrapped his arms around all three of us as we walked to our car, and once we were safely inside with the doors closed, I completely broke down. My hands shook on the steering wheel and Wade gently moved me to the passenger seat, taking over driving duties while I cried harder than I'd cried in years. In the back seat, Faye's small voice asked, "Mama, are we bad kids? Is that why Grandma doesn't want us to eat?" I unbuckled my seatbelt and climbed into the back, pulling both my babies into my arms. "You are perfect," I told them fiercely. "You are loved and wanted and perfect, and none of this is your fault. Not one single bit." As Wade drove us home through the dark streets, I made a decision that I knew would change everything. No more family gatherings, no more holidays with people who didn't value my children, no more pretending everything was fine when it absolutely wasn't. I was done being the family doormat, done teaching my kids that love meant accepting mistreatment, done sacrificing their well-being for the sake of keeping peace with people who clearly didn't care about keeping peace with us. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and my phone buzzing nonstop with incoming text messages. Every single one was from my mother, Dorothea, and the progression from angry to manipulative to victimized was almost impressive in its predictability. The first message, sent at 6 in the morning, read, "You ruined Thanksgiving for everyone. I hope you're happy with yourself." The second one came 10 minutes later. "Your father didn't sleep all night because of what you did. You're tearing this family apart with your selfishness." By message number 12, Shed shifted tactics entirely. "I don't understand why you hate us so much. All we've ever done is try to help this family. Why are you doing this to us?" I sat at my kitchen table in my pajamas with cold coffee in front of me, reading through the messages with a strange sense of detachment, like I was observing someone else's life instead of my own. Wade came downstairs and found me staring at my phone, and he gently took it from my hands and set it face down on the table. "Don't respond," he said firmly. "Not yet. Let them sit with what they did for a while." But the messages didn't stop, and by noon my father Hubert called me directly. I almost didn't answer, my finger hovering over the decline button, but some old habit of obedience made me pick up. "Marlene, we need to talk about yesterday," he said without any greeting or warmth in his voice. "Your mother is very upset. You embarrassed us in front of the whole family. You need to apologize to your sister and to your mother, and we need to move past this." I felt that old familiar pressure to cave, to smooth things over, to be the peacemaker, but then I remembered Faye's face when she asked if she was a bad kid and my resolve hardened like steel. "No," I said simply. "I'm not apologizing for standing up for my children. You should be apologizing to me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then my father said in a cold voice I'd never heard him use before, "Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss." And he hung up on me. I sat there holding my phone, feeling like I'd just been punched in the stomach, but underneath the hurt there was also something else, something that felt almost like relief. By evening, Gretchen had posted on social media, because of course she had. Her status update didn't mention names, but it might as well have had my photo attached. Some people can't handle when others get a little help from family. Jealousy is an ugly thing. Grateful for my parents who actually understand what family means. Within an hour, the post had 37 likes and dozens of comments from relatives and mutual friends, most of them supportive of her, most of them implying that someone in the family was being unreasonable and dramatic. My phone started buzzing with messages from people I hadn't heard from in months. Everyone suddenly very interested in what happened at Thanksgiving. My cousin from my father's side sent a carefully worded text. "Hey, I saw Gretchen's post. Is everything okay? Do you want to talk?" I didn't respond to any of them because I knew that anything I said would be twisted and reported back to my parents and my sister. The court of public opinion had already decided I was the villain in this story, and nothing I said would change that narrative. The worst part came later that evening when Dexter came to me with tears in his eyes, holding his tablet. "Mom," he said quietly, "some of the kids at school saw Aunt Gretchen's post because their parents are friends with her. They're saying mean things about us." My heart shattered into a million pieces as I realized that my sisters need to be right, to be the victim, to win the sympathy of strangers on the internet was more important to her than protecting her own nephew and niece from bullying. I held Dexter close and promised him that things would get better, even though I had no idea if that was true. That night after the kids were asleep, I sat down with Wade in our living room and asked him the question he'd been afraid to voice. Am I wrong? Am I being selfish, like they say? Wade looked at me with more intensity than I'd ever seen and said, You are the furthest thing from selfish. You have given and given and given to people who only take. The fact that you're even questioning yourself shows how much they've manipulated you over the years. The next day brought another bombshell that I never saw coming. My cousin Hazel, Uncle Randall's daughter who had always been close to growing up, called me and asked if we could meet for coffee. Something in her voice told me this wasn't just a friendly catch-up. So I agreed and we met at a cafe halfway between our houses. Hazel looked nervous as she stirred sugar into her coffee, not making eye contact, and finally she said in a rush, I need to tell you something, and you're going to be really angry, but you deserve to know the truth. My stomach dropped because I just knew, that whatever she was about to tell me would make everything so much worse. Your parents have been giving Gretchen money every single month, Hazel said quietly. Like, a lot of money. My dad mentioned it to my mom and I overheard them talking about it. Apparently, it's been going on for over 2 years now. About $1,200 a month, and it's coming from that family emergency fund that you contributed to. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications sank in. The fund I put $15,000 into when Dad had his heart surgery. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Hazel nodded miserably. Everyone in the family knows about it, Marlene. We all just assumed you knew too and were okay with it. I had no idea you didn't know until yesterday when everything blew up. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, doing the math in my head. $1,200 a month for 2 years was almost $29,000. $29,000 of family money. Money that I had contributed a huge chunk of, had been funneled directly to my sister to fund her lifestyle while I worked 2 jobs and struggled to save for a house, and sometimes had to say no to my kids when they asked for new shoes because money was tight. When I got home, I didn't even take off my coat before I was dialing my parents' number, and my mother answered on the second ring, sounding hopeful like maybe I was calling to apologize. Marlene, I'm so glad you called. We really need to. I cut her off before she could finish. Have you been giving Gretchen money from the emergency fund? I demanded. Have you been taking money that I contributed and giving it to her every month? The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know before my mother even spoke. She needed it more than anyone else, Dorothea said defensively. She has 3 kids to raise, and no help. What were we supposed to do? Let her struggle when we had the means to help? My father got on the line, and I could hear the phone being passed between them. Marlene, your sister's situation is an emergency, he said in that patronizing tone. She was about to lose her apartment. She couldn't afford groceries some weeks. We did what any decent parents would do. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience, floating above this conversation and watching myself implode. I contributed $15,000 to that fund when you had your heart surgery, Dad, I said, my voice shaking with rage. You looked me in the eye and promised that money was for family emergencies, for medical bills or true crisis situations. You promised it wouldn't be used frivolously. And you've been funneling it to Gretchen so she can continue to make poor financial decisions without facing any consequences. My mother's voice came back on, shrill and defensive. How dare you call your sister's struggles frivolous? She needed that help. You didn't. You have a good job and a husband. You don't understand what it's like to be a single mother. I laughed bitterly, a sound with no humor in it at all. No, I don't have those struggles, but only because I made different choices. I worked hard, I got an education, I married someone responsible, I don't spend money I don't have, but apparently making good choices means I get punished, while making bad choices means you get rewarded. My father's voice came through cold and final. If that's how you feel, then maybe we don't need to continue this conversation. And for the second time in 2 days, my parent hung up on me. I stood there in my kitchen, still wearing my coat, holding my phone and feeling like the entire foundation of my life had just crumbled beneath my feet. When Wade came home from work an hour later and found me sitting in the dark, he didn't ask what happened. He just held me while I cried and told him everything Hazel had revealed. "We're done with them," I said into his shoulder. "Completely done. No more trying to fix this. No more giving them chances. They've shown me who they are, and am finally ready to believe them." Wade just nodded and held me tighter, and I knew had been waiting for me to come to this conclusion for a very long time. That evening, my Aunt Celeste called me, the one person from yesterday who had actually spoken up in my defense. "I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself," she said warmly. "I should have said something years ago. I watched your mother treat you like you were less important than Gretchen your whole life, and I stayed quiet because I didn't want to cause family drama. But you're doing the right thing, Marlene. You're protecting your babies, and that's what matters." 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, just when I thought maybe the dust was starting to settle and my family would leave me alone to lick my wounds in peace, Gretchen launched what can only be described as a full-scale smear campaign across every social media platform she had access to. I woke up one Monday morning to find that Shed posted a long, detailed Facebook status that painted me as a monster who had abandoned my struggling single mother sister out of pure jealousy and spite. The post read, "It's heartbreaking when your own sister turns her back on you and your children because she can't handle seeing you receive help from your parents. Some people would rather see their family struggle than admit they're not the center of attention anymore. I'm just grateful my kids have grandparents who actually understand what family loyalty means, even if their aunt has decided blood means nothing." The post was accompanied by photos from Thanksgiving of her kids smiling with my parents, deliberately chosen to show what a happy, loving family they all were without me there to ruin it. Within hours, the post had been shared 63 times and had over 200 comments, and I watched in horror as extended family members I'd known my whole life publicly took sides against me. My father's sister commented, "Family is everything. It's sad when pride gets in the way of love." One of my mother's cousins wrote, "I always knew Marlene was the jealous type. Poor Gretchen just trying to raise her babies." Even some of my old high school friends who I hadn't spoken to in years felt compelled to weigh in with generic comments about forgiveness and family being forever. Over the next several days, Gretchen kept up the pressure with a constant stream of posts that never mentioned my name but were clearly directed at me. She shared memes about toxic family members with captions like, "Sometimes the people you think you can trust are the ones who hurt you most." She posted inspirational quotes about rising above jealousy and negativity. She shared articles about adult sibling rivalry with her own commentary about how sad it was when one sibling couldn't be happy for another's success. Each post got dozens of supportive comments from people who had no idea what had actually happened, but were more than willing to believe her version of events where she was the innocent victim and I was the villain. The extended family began actively choosing sides, and the division was stark and painful. Uncle Randall and his wife Bertie came down firmly on my parents' side, sending me a long text message about how disappointed they were in my behavior and how I needed to apologize and make things right. My cousin from my mother's side sent a similar message filled with platitudes about family forgiveness and moving past disagreements. But Aunt Celeste remained steadfast in her support, calling me every few days to check in and remind me that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd witnessed and experienced was real and valid. A handful of cousins reached out privately to say they believed me and thought my parents had always favored Gretchen, but most of them were too afraid to say anything publicly for fear of being ostracized themselves. The division in the family was complete, with clear battle lines drawn and very little neutral territory left. Then things escalated in a way I never could have anticipated or prepared for. Gretchen, apparently not satisfied with destroying my reputation on social media, decided to take her campaign to my workplace. I got called into my boss Curtis' office on a Wednesday afternoon, and the moment I saw his serious expression, I knew something was wrong. "Marlene, I received a very strange phone call this morning," he said carefully. "A woman claiming to be your sister called and told me I should know that you're dealing with some serious mental health issues right now. She said you've been having violent outbursts and making threats, and she was concerned about whether you're stable enough to be working with patients." I felt like I'd been doused with ice water, shock and disbelief washing over me in equal measure. "She did what?" I managed to say. Curtis held up his hand reassuringly. "I want you to know that I didn't believe her for a second. You've worked here for 6 years, and you're one of the most professional, stable people on my staff. But I thought you should know that someone is trying to damage your professional reputation." I sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk and told him everything, the whole sordid story from beginning to end, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he shook his head in amazement. "Family drama is unfortunately common," he said sympathetically. "Don't worry about your job, it's secure. But you might want to consider documenting everything in case this escalates further." His words proved prophetic because 3 days later, I received official court documents that made my blood run cold. Gretchen had filed for a restraining order against me, claiming that during the Thanksgiving argument I had threatened her and her children and she feared for their safety. The petition was filled with lies, claiming I had screamed threats, used violent language, and exhibited behavior that made her genuinely afraid I would harm her or her kids. None of it was true, not a single word, but seeing it there in official legal language on court documents made it feel real and terrifying. Wade was absolutely livid when I showed him the papers, pacing around our kitchen with his face red and his hands clenched into fists. "This is insane," he kept saying. "This is absolutely insane. She's lying under oath. She's committing perjury. I had to hire a lawyer, a sharp woman named Barrett who specialized in family law and had seen cases like mine before. The retainer was $2,000 that we absolutely did not have in our budget, money that should have gone toward Christmas presents for our kids or the new tires our car desperately needed." Barrett reviewed all the documents and assured me that Gretchen's case was weak and full of holes, but that didn't stop me from spiraling into anxiety about having to go to court and defend myself against accusations that were completely fabricated. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and those 3 weeks were some of the longest of my life. During that awful waiting period, my parents sent me a registered letter, the kind that requires a signature and comes with official postage, which somehow made it feel even more final and devastating. The letter was typed on my father's old computer and printed on formal letterhead like they were a law firm instead of just my mom and dad. It read, "Marlene, we have tried to be patient and understanding, but your behavior over the past weeks has made it clear that you are not interested in being part of this family. Your actions have caused tremendous pain to your sister and to us. We are demanding that you apologize to Gretchen and make amends for the damage you've caused. Until you do so, we cannot have a relationship with you. We raised you to be better than this. Think carefully about what you're doing to your children by depriving them of their grandparents. Think about what you're doing to your sister, who has done nothing but try to survive difficult circumstances. Your pride is destroying this family, and the responsibility for that destruction lies entirely on your shoulders. Your children are losing their grandparents because of your choices, your selfishness, your inability to see beyond your own hurt feelings. We hope you come to your senses before it's too late." I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling like someone was tightening a vice around my chest. The guilt-tripping was masterful, designed to make me question everything, to make me feel like maybe I really was the problem, maybe I really was being selfish and unreasonable. I showed the letter to Aunt Celeste, who read it with her lips pressed into a thin line of anger. "This is manipulation," she said firmly. "This is what they do, Marlene. They make you doubt yourself. They make you think you're crazy for having boundaries. Don't fall for it." But even with her support, I felt myself starting to crack under the pressure. I wasn't sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, jerking awake with anxiety, dreams about court hearings, and losing my job and my kids asking why their family hated them. I was losing weight because I could barely eat, my stomach constantly churning with stress. I started having full-blown panic attacks, sudden overwhelming waves of terror that left me gasping for breath and shaking. Wade insisted I see a therapist, making the appointment himself because he knew I wouldn't do it. And I started meeting weekly with a kind woman named Vivian who specialized in family trauma. In our very first session, after Eid laid out the whole history from childhood to present, Vivian sat back in her chair and said something that changed my entire perspective. "Marlene, you've been the scapegoat child your entire life, while your sister has been the golden child. This isn't a new pattern that started with your kids. This has been happening since you were young. You were just trained to accept it as normal." She helped me see that I'd been apologizing for my own existence, my whole life, making myself smaller and quieter and less demanding because somewhere along the way, I'd learned that being low maintenance was the only way to earn scraps of love from parents who had already decided which daughter deserved their full devotion. That session was like having a light turned on in a dark room I'd been stumbling around in for 34 years. I finally understood that the problem wasn't me. It had never been me, and that realization gave me the strength to stop second-guessing my decision to protect my children from people who had been hurting them since they were born. 3 weeks before the restraining order hearing, when I was already stretched thin emotionally and financially and mentally, Cousin Hazel reached out again with information that made everything so much worse than I'd even imagined. She called me on a Saturday morning sounding nervous and upset, asking if we could meet in person because what she had to tell me was too serious for a phone conversation. We met at a park near her house, sitting on a bench while her kids played on the swings nearby, and she pulled out her phone with a grim expression. "I did some digging after our last conversation," she said quietly. "My dad has access to some family financial stuff because he helped your parents set up their retirement accounts years ago. Has been keeping quiet about this, but I think you have a right to know." What she showed me on her phone screen made my entire world tilt sideways. My parents had opened a credit card in my name 5 years ago, when I was 29 and had just started my job at the dental clinic. They'd used my social security number and forged my signature on the application, and they'd immediately maxed out the $17,000 limit to fund Gretchen's business venture, a boutique clothing store that Shed dreamed about opening in a strip mall on the other side of town. The boutique had failed spectacularly within 8 months, never making enough money to cover even basic expenses, and it had closed, leaving Gretchen with boxes of unsold inventory and my parents with a massive debt on a credit card that was in my name. For the first few years, they'd made the minimum monthly payments, so I never knew the card existed, but 6 months ago they'd stopped paying entirely, and the account had gone into collections. The debt had ballooned with late fees and interest to over $20,000, and collection agencies had been calling a phone number associated with my social security number, not my actual cell phone, so I'd never received any of the calls or notices. "How did I not know about this?" I asked Hazel, my voice hollow with shock. "How is this possible?" She explained that identity theft within families is more common than people realize, and often goes undetected for years because the victims trust their family members and don't regularly check their credit reports. The realization hit me like a freight train. This explained why Wade and I had been denied a mortgage loan last year when Wed tried to buy our first house. The loan officer had said there were some issues with my credit history that needed to be resolved, and I'd been so embarrassed and confused because I'd always paid my bills on time, always been responsible with money. I'd blamed myself, assumed I'd done something wrong with my finances, never imagining that my own parents had sabotaged my financial future to prop up my sister's failing business. I drove straight home and pulled my credit report for the first time in years, and there it was in black and white. A credit card from a bank I'd never used, opened in 2020, current balance of $20,372. Status showing as 180 days delinquent, massive negative impact on my credit score. My score had dropped from the 700 range where it had been to below 500, completely destroying any chance Wade and I had of buying a house or getting approved for any kind of loan. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the report with tears streaming down my face, and Wade found me there an hour later, still frozen in shock. When I showed him the evidence, his reaction was immediate and decisive. "We're pressing charges," he said firmly. "This is identity theft. This is fraud. This is a felony. They don't get to do this to you and walk away." I called lawyer Barrett immediately, sending her photos of the credit report and all the documentation Hazel had provided. Barrett's response was swift and professional. "This is a clear-cut case of identity theft, Marlene. We can absolutely prosecute this. It's a serious crime with serious consequences." But even with the evidence right in front of me, even with the lawyer's confirmation that what my parents had done was criminal, I struggled with the decision. These were my parents, the people who had raised me and fed me and put a roof over my head for 18 years. Could I really be the daughter who sent her own mother and father to prison? Wade saw me hesitating and sat down across from me with an intensity in his eyes I'd never seen before. "They destroyed your credit," he said slowly. "They stole your identity. They used your social security number to commit fraud. They chose Gretchen over you every single time for your entire life. At what point do they face consequences for their actions?" That evening, Aunt Celeste came over after I called her crying and told her what I'd discovered. She wasn't surprised, which somehow made it worse. "Your mother has always been manipulative, sweetheart," she said sadly. "Even when we were growing up, She had this way of twisting everything to benefit herself and making everyone else feel guilty for questioning her. Your father just goes along with whatever she says because it's easier than standing up to her. Then Celeste revealed more family history that I'd never known. Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was supposed to be putting together. When I was in college, working 3 jobs and taking out student loans because my parents said they couldn't afford to help with tuition, they were simultaneously paying for Gretchen's entire college education at a private school that cost $40,000 a year. Gretchen had dropped out after her freshman year, deciding college wasn't for her, and that $40,000 had essentially been flushed down the toilet while I'd graduated with $60,000 in student loan debt. When I got married to Wade 7 years ago in a small ceremony at a local garden venue, my parents had contributed $500 and complained the entire time about how expensive everything was. When Gretchen got married 5 years ago to a man she'd known for 6 months in a lavish ceremony at a country club, my parents had spent $15,000 on the wedding and told everyone who would listen how proud they were. That marriage had lasted exactly 2 years before ending in a messy divorce, but nobody ever mentioned the money that had been wasted on celebrating a union that was doomed from the start. Every major life milestone, every moment that should have been equal, had been weighted heavily in Gretchen's favor, while I was expected to be independent and self-sufficient and grateful for whatever scraps I received. I felt like my entire childhood and adulthood had been a carefully constructed lie, a narrative where I was the responsible, successful daughter who didn't need help, and Gretchen was the struggling, helpless daughter who needed constant rescue. But the truth was that I'd been systematically denied the support and love and financial assistance that had been freely given to my sister, and that denial had been framed as me being strong and capable instead of what it actually was: favoritism and neglect. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called Lawyer Barrett and told her, my voice shaking but determined, "File charges. I'm done protecting people who never protected me. They need to face consequences for what they've done." The restraining order hearing was now only 2 weeks away, and I knew that when the identity theft charges came to light, everything was going to explode in ways I couldn't even predict. Gretchen was posting on social media almost daily now, vague status updates about family betrayal and people showing their true colors, building sympathy and support from people who only knew her version of events. One post read, "When you realize the person you thought you could trust would rather destroy the family than admit they were wrong, truth always wins in the end." She had no idea that truth was about to reveal something very different from the narrative she'd been spinning. The day of the restraining order hearing arrived cold and gray, perfect pathetic fallacy for the disaster I knew was coming. Wade took the day off work to come with me to the county courthouse, a imposing brick building downtown where I'd never imagined I'd have to defend myself against my own sister's lies. Lawyer Barrett met us in the lobby wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase full of documentation and evidence. "Remember," she said as we rode the elevator up to the family court floor, "stay calm, answer questions directly, don't get emotional. The judge will see through her story pretty quickly once we present our evidence." Gretchen arrived with our parents flanking her on either side like bodyguards, all 3 of them dressed conservatively and looking appropriately serious for the occasion. When they saw me across the hallway, my mother Dorothea shot me a look of pure hatred that actually made me take a step backward. We were called into the courtroom at exactly 2 in the afternoon, and Judge Adelaide, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back severely and sharp, intelligent eyes, presided over the proceedings. The courtroom was small and plain with fluorescent lighting that made everything look washed out and institutional. Gretchen was called to testify first, taking the witness stand with an expression of practiced vulnerability. She was good, I had to give her that. She'd perfected the role of frightened victim. She claimed in a trembling voice that during the Thanksgiving dinner argument, I had screamed graphic threats about hurting her and her children, that I had made violent gestures that terrified everyone present, and that she had been living in fear ever since, afraid that I would show up at her house or her kids' school to make good on my threats. "Can you describe exactly what threats were made?" Judge Adelaide asked, pen poised over her notepad. Gretchen took a dramatic breath and said, "She said she would make me regret ever being born. She said she would destroy me and everything I loved. She said I didn't deserve to have children and maybe someone should take them away from me." Each word was a lie, such a complete fabrication that I actually gasped out loud before Barrett put a warning hand on my arm. "And are there witnesses who heard these threats?" the judge asked. Gretchen nodded eagerly. My parents were there. They heard everything. They can confirm every word. My mother and father both nodded from their seats in the gallery, backing up her story with their silent support. When it was time for my side to present our case, Barrett called me to the stand first. She walked me through what actually happened at Thanksgiving, asking me to describe the events in detail. I explained calmly about my children being told to wait while Gretchen's children ate, about years of favoritism and unequal treatment, about my decision to leave rather than subject my kids to more pain. Did you at any point threaten your sister or her children? Barrett asked directly. Absolutely not, I said firmly. I was angry and I raised my voice, but I never threatened anyone. I simply said I was done and we were leaving. Barrett then presented the text message records from my phone, showing that there had been zero communication between me and Gretchen after Thanksgiving, no harassment, no threatening messages, nothing that would indicate I was dangerous or unstable. Wade took the stand next, and his testimony was clear and unwavering. My wife never threatened anyone, he said, looking directly at Judge Adelaide. She stood up for our children who were being treated poorly. She raised her voice in frustration, but there were no threats of any kind. I was standing right there the entire time. Then Aunt Celeste testified, and she didn't hold back. I was present for the entire argument, she said. Marlene was calm until she was provoked repeatedly. She never threatened anyone. My niece Gretchen is lying, and frankly, this restraining order request is retaliatory because Marlene discovered some financial improprieties within the family. Barrett then turned her attention to questioning Gretchen directly, and this was where things got really interesting. Miss Gretchen, you claim there were verbal threats made, Barrett said calmly. Do you have any recordings of these threats? Any videos? Any physical evidence whatsoever? Gretchen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. They were verbal threats, she repeated. I didn't think to record them in the moment because I was scared. Barrett raised her eyebrows. So you have zero concrete evidence of any threats, just your word against my client's word. Gretchen's voice rose defensively. Everyone who was there heard it. Ask my parents, they'll tell you. Barrett smiled slightly. But we also have witnesses who were there who say no threats were made. So it seems we have conflicting accounts, doesn't it? Then Barrett dropped the bombshell, introducing the evidence of the identity theft into the court record. She presented the credit card statements, showing the card opened in my name, the documentation proving Id never signed the application, the timeline showing the card was used to fund Gretchen's failed business. Your Honor, Barrett said formally. This restraining order request came exactly 1 week after my client discovered that her parents had committed identity theft against her, opening a credit card in her name and using it to fund the respondent's business venture. This appears to be a clear case of retaliation, an attempt to silence my client and prevent her from pursuing legal action against her family members. Judge Adelaide's expression shifted from neutral interest to sharp focus, and she leaned forward in her chair. Is there an open investigation into this alleged identity theft? She asked. Barrett nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Detective Lionel with the Fraud Division is currently investigating, and charges are likely to be filed. The judge looked at Gretchen, then at my parents sitting in the gallery with matching expressions of horror as they realized their secret was now public record in a court of law. Miss Gretchen, Judge Adelaide said slowly, can you explain why you filed for this restraining order exactly 1 week after these financial issues came to light? Gretchen stammered, clearly caught off guard. I didn't know about any of that. I filed because I was scared. The timing is just coincidence. The judge didn't look convinced. She reviewed the documentation Barrett had provided, flipping through pages of evidence while the courtroom sat in tense silence. Finally, she looked up, and her decision was swift and decisive. Request for restraining order is denied, she said firmly. There is no credible evidence supporting the claim of threats or dangerous behavior. The court finds that this request appears to be retaliatory in nature, filed in bad faith as a response to the family conflict described. Motion denied. Gretchen's face went from pale to bright red, fury replacing the calculated vulnerability she'd been performing. This is insane, she said loudly, standing up from the witness stand. She threatened me and my kids, and you're just going to let her get away with it. Judge Adelaide's voice turned cold. Miss Gretchen, I suggest you sit down. Making false statements in a legal proceeding is a serious matter. You're lucky I'm not pursuing perjury charges. This hearing is concluded." Gretchen stormed out of the courtroom with my parents scrambling after her, and I could hear my mother's voice in the hallway yelling that this was an outrage, that the system was broken, that I'd somehow manipulated the judge. Wade put his arm around me, and Barrett shook my hand with a satisfied smile. "That went exactly as I expected," she said. "Now let's talk about the next steps with the identity theft case." Outside the courthouse, Gretchen confronted me one final time as we were walking to our car. She got right in my face, her carefully applied makeup smudged now with angry tears, and she spat the words, "You're going to regret this, Marlene. You're going to regret destroying this family. Mom and Dad will never forgive you." I looked at her calmly, feeling strangely powerful after winning in court, and said something I'd been wanting to say for years. "The only thing I regret is not standing up to all of you sooner. You can't bully me anymore. I'm done being afraid of you." Wade gently guided me away and we walked to our car in silence, both of us processing what had just happened. The restraining order battle was over, but I knew the war was far from finished. Later that afternoon, I met with Detective Lionel at the police station to file the formal police report for identity theft. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who listened to my story without judgment. "Unfortunately, family theft cases are extremely common," he said sympathetically. "Parents stealing from children, siblings stealing from each other, it happens more than you'd think. Well, investigate thoroughly, and if the evidence supports criminal charges, well, move forward with prosecution." I signed all the necessary paperwork, provided copies of all my documentation, and walked out of that police station feeling like maybe, just maybe, justice might actually be served. The weeks following the restraining order hearing brought a complete fracturing of my extended family, with people taking sides so publicly and definitively that there was no longer any middle ground where someone could claim neutrality or try to stay out of the drama. My parents sent me one final message through email, clearly crafted to hurt as deeply as possible. "Marlene, you are no longer our daughter. You have chosen your pride over your family, and you have destroyed relationships that can never be repaired. Do not contact us again. As far as we are concerned, you do not exist." I read those words sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee, and I felt a strange combination of crushing grief and enormous relief wash over me simultaneously. The grief was for the parents I had always wished I had, the loving, supportive, encouraging parents who existed in my fantasies but never in reality. The relief was because I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to perform the role of grateful daughter, no longer had to subject my children to people who clearly saw them as less valuable than their cousins. Wade found me crying at the table and pulled me into his arms, letting me sob until I had no tears left. "You have us," he said firmly into my hair. "Me, Dexter, Faye, we're your real family. We're the people who actually love you." When I finally told Dexter and Faye that we wouldn't be seeing Grandma and Grandpa anymore, I expected sadness or confusion, but instead Dexter looked almost relieved. "I'm kind of glad, Mom," he said quietly. "They were always mean to us anyway. They made me feel bad about myself." Faye, who was now 7 and remarkably perceptive for her age, asked if Aunt Celeste could be their grandma instead, which made me laugh through fresh tears. "Aunt Celeste already loves you like a grandmother does," I told her. "So, I think we can make that work." Aunt Celeste fully embraced her new role as surrogate grandmother, stepping up in ways that showed me what real family love actually looked like. She started coming to all of Dexter's soccer games and Faye's dance recitals. She invited us over for Sunday dinners at her house. She taught both kids how to bake cookies and plant vegetables in her garden. One afternoon, while the kids were playing in her backyard, she pulled me aside and said something I desperately needed to hear. I should have said something years ago. "I watched your mother treat you like you were less important than Gretchen for your entire life, and I stayed silent because I didn't want to rock the boat or cause family conflict. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Cousin Hazel also remained a steady presence, calling me weekly to check in and becoming a genuine friend instead of just a family obligation. Uncle Randall surprised me by reaching out with an apology about a month after the court hearing. He sent a long text message that started with, "I was wrong to side with your parents without hearing your side of the story. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I can see now that they've been treating you unfairly for years. I'm sorry I didn't support you when you needed it." His wife Bertie, however, continued to support my parents and Gretchen, which caused significant tension in their marriage, according to Hazel. Apparently, Bertie had been posting on social media about family loyalty and forgiveness, clearly directed at Randall for daring to change his position and support me instead of maintaining family unity at all costs. Detective Lionel called me with updates on the identity theft investigation, and the news was both validating and terrifying. The credit card company had confirmed that the signature on the application didn't match any signatures they had on file for me. The IP address used to complete the online portion of the application traced back to my parents' home computer, and there was a clear paper trail showing the money had been transferred directly to Gretchen's failed business account. We have enough evidence to file charges. Lionel told me seriously. Your parents could be charged with identity theft, which is a Class H felony in this state, punishable by up to 3 years in prison and fines up to $10,000. Are you prepared for what comes next? I thought about my children, about the example I was setting for them, about boundaries and consequences and self-worth, and I said yes. Gretchen panicked when she heard about the pending charges, and she tried to reach out to me through our mutual friend Coral, someone we'd both gone to high school with who had somehow remained neutral through all of this. Coral called me sounding uncomfortable and asked if we could meet for coffee because Gretchen had something she wanted to communicate. I told Coral that anything Gretchen wanted to say to me could be said through lawyers, and I wasn't interested in having any direct contact. But Coral persisted, saying that Gretchen was really sorry and just wanted to make things right before this went too far. I finally agreed to hear the message, and Coral read from her phone, "Your sister says she's sorry for filing the restraining order. She admits she was scared about the legal trouble and reacted badly. She's asking if you'll consider dropping the charges against Mom and Dad. She says they're old and they'll go to jail and it will destroy them. She promises she'll pay you back the money herself. She just needs time. She says you're still family, and families are supposed to forgive each other." I listened to this whole message and then I said very calmly, "Tell my sister that sorry isn't enough. She tried to destroy my reputation, tried to get a restraining order against me based on complete lies, tried to get me fired from my job, and publicly dragged my name through the mud on social media. Our parents committed a crime against me and destroyed my credit. Actions have consequences, and am done being the person in this family who absorbs all the damage and pretends everything is fine." Coral looked uncomfortable but nodded, and I never heard from her again. Gretchen sent me one desperate email directly, bypassing the no-contact boundary ID tried to establish. "Please, Marlene, drop the charges. Mom and Dad are terrified. They're sorry for everything. I'll make sure they pay you back every penny. Don't do this. Don't be the daughter who sends her parents to prison. We can fix this as a family." I showed the email to lawyer Barrett, who advised me not to respond, and I didn't. Meanwhile, my own life was improving in ways I hadn't expected. I got promoted at the dental clinic to office manager with a raise of $8,000 per year, which meant I could finally quit my weekend bookkeeping job and have actual days off to spend with my family. Dexter's teacher called to tell me Head made honor roll for the first time and seemed much happier and more confident at school. Faye joined a dance class and came home bubbling with excitement after every lesson, finally able to just be a kid without the weight of grandparent disapproval hanging over her. My marriage with Wade grew stronger than it had ever been, forged in the fire of this crisis, and we started talking seriously about trying for a third baby once things settled down. I continued therapy with Vivian every week, working through childhood wounds and learning to set boundaries and understanding that cutting out toxic family members wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. Christmas approached, and for the first time in my adult life, I wouldn't be spending it with my parents and extended family. The thought was both liberating and sad, tinged with grief for traditions that would never happen again, and relief that we could create new traditions without the undercurrent of tension and favoritism. Aunt Celeste invited us to celebrate Christmas at her house with her immediate family, and it was one of the most peaceful, joyful holidays I'd ever experienced. There were no expensive gifts designed to make anyone feel less than, no competitions about who got what, no undercurrents of resentment or favoritism. Just people who genuinely loved each other, eating good food and laughing, and watching the kids play with simple toys that brought them actual joy. On Christmas night, after Wade tucked exhausted, happy children into bed, Wade pulled me close and said, "This is what it's supposed to feel like. This is what family should be." And I realized he was absolutely right. 3 months after the restraining order hearing, District Attorney Franklin contacted me with news that both terrified and vindicated me. The state was moving forward with criminal charges against my parents for identity theft, which was being charged as a Class H felony, carrying a potential sentence of up to 3 years in prison and substantial fines. Because Gretchen had knowingly benefited from the fraudulent credit card, receiving funds directly from it for her business, she could potentially be charged as an accessory to the crime, though the DA's office was still deciding whether to pursue that angle. The evidence is overwhelming, Franklin told me in his office downtown. The credit card company has provided everything we need. The question now is how you want to proceed. Your parents have hired a lawyer and they're trying to negotiate a plea deal. They're willing to pay back the full amount plus interest if you agree to drop the charges. What do you want to do? I sat in that utilitarian government office with fluorescent lights humming overhead and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me from all sides. Part of me wanted justice. Wanted them to face real consequences for what they'd done, wanted them to understand that stealing from your own daughter isn't something you get to walk away from without punishment. But another part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to be accommodating and understanding and to put family peace above personal needs, whispered that sending my own parents to prison would make me just as bad as them. I spent a week agonizing over the decision, talking it through with Wade and Aunt Celeste and my therapist Vivian. Wade's position was clear. They need to be held accountable. If you let this go, what message does that send to Dexter and Faye? That family can abuse you and steal from you and face no consequences as long as they're related to you. Therapist Vivian asked me a question that cut right to the heart of the matter. What do you need in order to feel like justice has been served? What outcome would allow you to move forward without resentment eating you alive? I thought about that question for days, turning it over in my mind during sleepless nights and distracted work hours, until I finally knew what I needed. I called District Attorney Franklin and told him I would agree to a plea deal, but only if my parents met very specific conditions. First, they had to pay back the full $17,000 they'd stolen, plus interest within 90 days, and if they failed to make any payment on time, the deal was void, and criminal prosecution would resume. Second, they had to attend mandatory family therapy/counseling for at least 6 months with a licensed therapist who specialized in family dysfunction and narcissistic patterns. Third, they had to provide a written apology to me and a separate written apology to my children, acknowledging the favoritism and the emotional abuse and taking full responsibility for their actions. Fourth, the theft had to be reported to all 3 credit bureaus and formally disputed so my credit could be repaired. If they agreed to all 4 conditions, I would support reducing the charges to a misdemeanor with probation instead of prison time. Franklin took my conditions to my parents' lawyer, and initially they refused outright. Absolutely not, my father apparently said. We won't be humiliated like that. We won't put our mistakes in writing for the world to see. Their lawyer, a man named Sheffield who specialized in white-collar crime, had to explain to them in very clear terms that this was the best deal they were going to get. Your other option is to go to trial, and if you're convicted of the felony charges, you're looking at prison time, Sheffield told them bluntly. Your daughter is being remarkably generous given what you did to her. I strongly advise you to accept these terms. Faced with the very real possibility of spending their retirement years in prison, my parents reluctantly agreed to the plea deal. The court-ordered payment plan was set up through the DA's office with strict deadlines and automatic consequences for missed payments. The mandatory family therapy sessions began 2 weeks later with a counselor named Marion, who had over 20 years of experience dealing with toxic family dynamics and narcissistic abuse patterns. I agreed to attend the first few sessions because Marion said it was necessary for the process to work, though I made it clear I had no expectations that anything would actually change. The first session was brutal in ways I wasn't fully prepared for. We all sat in Marion's comfortable office with soft lighting and abstract art on the walls that was probably meant to be calming, and Marion asked my parents to explain in their own words why we were there. My mother, Dorothea, immediately launched into victim mode, tears streaming down her face as she talked about how Shed only ever tried to help her struggling daughter Gretchen and how I was tearing the family apart by being vindictive and unforgiving. Marion let her talk for about 5 minutes before holding up her hand and stopping her mid-sentence. Mrs. Dorothea, I need you to understand something very clearly, Marion said in a firm but kind voice. You committed a crime against your daughter Marlene. You opened a credit card in her name without her knowledge or consent, which is identity theft, which is a felony. You destroyed her credit score and put her in financial jeopardy. Additionally, you have treated your grandchildren with clear favoritism, showing preference to one daughter's children while making the other daughter's children feel less valuable and less loved. This isn't about you being a victim. This is about you taking responsibility for serious harm you've caused. My mother's tears dried up immediately, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of anger. My father Hubert sat silent in his chair, staring at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Over the next several sessions, Marian methodically dismantled every excuse and justification my parents tried to offer. When my mother claimed they gave Gretchen more help because she needed it more, Marian asked, "And did Marlene never need help? Did she never struggle? Or did you just decide she was strong enough to handle things on her own while you enabled Gretchen's poor decisions?" When my father tried to minimize the favoritism by saying kids don't really notice these things, Marian pulled out developmental psychology research showing how deeply damaging parental favoritism is to children's mental health and self-esteem. When they tried to blame me for being too sensitive or holding grudges, Marian shut it down immediately. Marlene is not the problem here. She set a healthy boundary after years of mistreatment. That's not holding a grudge, that's self-preservation. Gretchen attended one session because Prosecutor Franklin said her potential charges could be reduced if she participated in family counseling. She came in hostile and defensive, arms crossed over her chest, making it clear she thought this was all a waste of time. Marian asked her a direct question. "Why do you think you deserve special treatment from your parents while your sister deserves nothing?" Gretchen sputtered and tried to explain that she didn't think she deserved special treatment. She just needed more help because her life was harder. Marian pressed, "And why was your life harder? What circumstances were beyond your control versus which ones were the result of your own choices?" Gretchen had no good answer for that. I finally spoke up, looking directly at my sister for the first time in months. "I needed help too, Gretchen. So many times. When Wade lost his job 3 years ago and we were behind on rent, when Faye had to go to the emergency room and we got a bill for $4,000, when our car broke down and we couldn't afford to fix it. I never asked Mom and Dad for help because I knew what the answer would be. I knew they'd say I was doing fine and I should handle it myself while you got handed money every time you wanted something." After several grueling sessions, there was finally a small breakthrough that felt significant even though it didn't fix everything. My father Hubert looked up from his hands where he'd been staring for most of the session and said quietly, "I failed you, Marlene. I let your mother dictate everything in this family, and I went along with it because it was easier than standing up to her. I saw how she treated you differently than Gretchen, and I told myself it wasn't that bad or that you were strong enough to handle it. But that was cowardly. I was your father, and I should have protected you, and I didn't. I'm sorry." It was the first real apology I'd ever received from either of my parents, and hearing it spoken out loud in that therapy office made something crack open inside my chest. My mother still couldn't quite get there, still held on to her defensive posture and her belief that she'd done nothing wrong, but Marian assured me that change takes time and sometimes people never fully get there. The written apologies were delivered as required by the plea agreement, though they felt forced and hollow, clearly written under duress rather than from genuine remorse. The letter to me included phrases like, "We regret that our actions caused you distress, and we acknowledge that we could have handled things differently," which were non-apologies that avoided taking real responsibility. The letter to my children was slightly better, telling Dexter and Faye that they were loved and valued and that grandparents had made mistakes that weren't the children's fault. The money was paid back in full over 3 months as promised, and seeing those deposits hit my bank account and watching my credit score slowly start to recover felt like a tangible form of justice. The criminal charges were officially reduced to misdemeanor fraud, with 3 years of probation and mandatory continued counseling, which meant my parents avoided prison time but would be on probation until they were well into their 70s. 6 months after that terrible Thanksgiving that had set everything in motion, I found myself sitting in my backyard on a warm spring evening watching Dexter and Faye chase fireflies through the grass while Wade grilled burgers on our secondhand grill. The scene was so ordinary, so perfectly mundane, and yet it represented a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. My life had been completely transformed, not in dramatic Hollywood movie ways but in small, quiet shifts that added up to something profound. I was in a healthier place mentally and emotionally than I'd been since childhood, finally free from the constant anxiety of trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their full affection. Therapy with Vivian had helped me understand patterns I'd never even noticed before, showing me how I'd been cast as the scapegoat child from early on while Gretchen played the golden child, and how that dynamic had shaped every interaction and every expectation within my family. The therapy helped me see that I was made the scapegoat precisely because I was independent and capable, because my parents knew I would survive without their constant support, which gave them permission to pour all their resources into Gretchen, who had learned to play helpless and demanding. It wasn't that I was less loved, though it certainly felt that way. It was that I was deemed less needy and therefore less worthy of investment. That pattern had started when I was young, probably around age 10 or 11 when Id started taking care of myself and helping around the house, while Gretchen threw tantrums and demanded attention, and Id internalized the message that being low maintenance and self-sufficient was how I earned whatever scraps of approval came my way. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it did help me stop blaming myself, stop questioning whether Id somehow caused or deserved the differential treatment. My children were thriving in ways that showed me just how much the toxic grandparent relationship had been affecting them. Dexter was more confident and outgoing, had made several close friends at school and joined the school's robotics club where he was apparently some kind of programming genius, according to his teacher. His grades had improved dramatically, and Head stopped having those terrible stomach aches he used to get every Sunday before we'd visit my parents' house. Faye was happier and more secure, no longer asking questions about why grandparents didn't love her enough, no longer crying before family events. Both kids had developed a close, loving relationship with Aunt Celeste, who filled the grandmother role better than my actual mother ever had. And they also adored Wade's parents, who lived a few states away but video called every week and sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and little gifts, chosen with actual thought and love. My marriage with Wade had grown stronger through this crisis in ways I hadn't expected. Going through something this difficult together, having him stand beside me when everyone else was telling me I was wrong, watching him defend our children fiercely against people who should have loved them unconditionally, all of it had deepened our bond and reminded me why I'd married him in the first place. We started planning a family vacation to Yellowstone for the summer, something Wed always talked about but never had the money or time for, and the kids were beyond excited. Wade told me one night as we were getting ready for bed, "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. I know it was the hardest thing you've ever done, and I watched you struggle with it, but you did it anyway. You protected our kids and you protected yourself, and that takes real courage." I had limited contact with my parents now, carefully controlled and boundaried in ways that protected my mental health and my children's well-being. We exchanged occasional text messages, usually brief and surface level, nothing deep or meaningful, that asked several times about seeing the grandchildren, and after discussion with my therapist and with Wade, I agreed to allow supervised visits once every 2 months with strict rules in place. The first visit was awkward and uncomfortable, with long silences and forced conversation, everyone walking on eggshells and trying not to say anything that might trigger another explosion. But my mother Dorothea had brought gifts for Dexter and Faye, and for the first time in their lives, the gifts were equal in value and thoughtfulness, no obvious favoritism on display. My father Hubert was quiet but kind, asking the kids about school and actually listening to their answers instead of immediately comparing them to Gretchen's kids. I had zero contact with Gretchen, and I was completely fine with that. Shed sent one text message about 3 months after everything exploded, just 3 words. "I'm sorry, Marlene." Id stared at that message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but ultimately Id decided not to respond. Sorry wasn't enough, and I didn't owe her forgiveness or reconciliation or anything else. According to Aunt Celeste, who still maintained some contact with Gretchen through family channels, my sister was struggling financially now that my parents had significantly cut back their support per the terms of their probation and court-ordered budget counseling. Apparently, Gretchen had to get a full-time job for the first time in years, and she was learning the hard way what it meant to actually support yourself and your children without constant bailouts. I felt no satisfaction hearing that, no sense of triumph or revenge, just a kind of neutral indifference that told me Id genuinely moved past needing anything from her. Id learned profound lessons through this whole nightmare experience. Truths about family and boundaries and self-worth that I wished Id understood decades earlier. I learned that the word family doesn't automatically entitle people to abuse you or take advantage of you or treat you as less than, and that blood relation doesn't override the basic human need for respect and fair treatment. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary, and that teaching your children to accept mistreatment in the name of family unity is actually teaching them that their worth is negotiable. I learned that you can't fix people who don't want to change, and that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from relationships that consistently hurt you no matter how much history you share. I learned that boundaries aren't mean or cruel, they're protective barriers that keep toxic behavior from poisoning your life and your children's lives. As a therapeutic exercise, Vivian had me write a letter to my younger self, never to be sent but just for my own healing. I poured everything into that letter over the course of several emotional sessions. Dear younger Marlene, I wrote, you deserved better. It wasn't your fault that Mom and Dad loved you less or differently than they loved Gretchen. You weren't too demanding when you asked for the same treatment your sister got. You weren't too sensitive when you felt hurt by the inequality. You weren't wrong to want your parents to show up for you the way they showed up for her. You were enough, exactly as you were, and their failure to see that was their blindness, not your inadequacy. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner. I'm sorry I let you believe for so long that being small and quiet and undemanding was the same as being loved. But I see you now, and am fighting for you now, and I promise that your daughters will never wonder if they're enough, because I will make sure they know they are. Writing that letter made me sob for an hour, grieving for the little girl had been and the teenager had been and the young woman had been, all the versions of myself who had swallowed hurt and pretended everything was fine. There was a powerful moment about a week after I'd written that letter when Faye came to me after dinner and climbed into my lap even though she was really getting too big for lap sitting. Mom, she said seriously, her small face very solemn. Are you happy now? The question caught me off guard, and I had to think about my answer. Yes, sweetie, I said slowly, realizing as I spoke that it was absolutely true. I really am happy now. Are you happy? She nodded vigorously, her pigtails bouncing. I'm really happy. I like when it's just us and Daddy and Dexter. I like Aunt Celeste. I like that we don't have to go to Grandma's house and feel sad anymore. Dexter, who'd been doing homework at the kitchen table, looked up and added his own perspective. Yeah, Mom, it's better now. You smile more. That night I stood in the doorway of my small, modest home looking at my family gathered in our living room, Wade reading a book in his worn armchair, Dexter building something complicated out of Legos, Faye coloring at the coffee table with her tongue stuck out in concentration, and I felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to my eyes. This was my family. These were the people who loved me without conditions or comparisons or competitions. These were the people who would show up for each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. We didn't have a lot of money. We lived in a small rental house with creaky floors and a leaky bathroom faucet. We drove an old car that needed new tires. But we had something far more valuable than any of that. We had genuine love and mutual respect and the safety to be ourselves without fear of judgment or rejection. The following Sunday we had dinner at Aunt Celeste's house, something that had become our new tradition. It was just the 6 of us, Celeste and her husband Palmer, and their adult son who was visiting from college, plus our family of 4. The meal was simple, roasted chicken and vegetables and homemade rolls, nothing fancy or elaborate. But it was filled with laughter and genuine conversation and kids being allowed to be kids without walking on eggshells. After dinner, Celeste pulled me aside while the others were clearing dishes and said something that I knew I'd remember forever. I watch you with your babies, and I see how much love you have for them, how fiercely you protect them, how you broke a cycle that could have continued for another generation. Your mother never learned how to love without conditions or favorites, but you did. You learned it on your own. And you're teaching it to Dexter and Faye. That's the real victory here, Marlene. Breaking the pattern. As I drove home that night with sleepy kids in the back seat and Wade's hand warm in mine, I reflected on everything I'd been through and everything I'd learned. I would never get the childhood I deserved. Never get the unconditional parental love that every child should receive as a birthright. Never get back the years I spent feeling like I wasn't good enough or wondering what was wrong with me that made my own parents prefer my sister. Those losses were real and they still hurt when I let myself think about them. But I'd built something better for the future. I'd built a family based on actual love instead of obligation, based on respect instead of hierarchy, based on equality instead of favoritism. My children would grow up knowing they were valued and cherished, not because of what they could do or how little trouble they caused, but simply because they existed. They would never stand in a kitchen waiting for crumbs while other children feasted, never wonder why they weren't good enough for their own grandparents' love, never learn that family means accepting abuse with a smile. I used to think family meant blood, meant sticking together no matter what, meant forgiving any transgression because that's what relatives do. Now I know that real family means love and respect and showing up when it matters. Real family means treating people with basic human decency and fairness. Real family means protecting children from harm even when that harm comes from within the family itself. Real family means being willing to set boundaries and enforce consequences when those boundaries are violated. And by that definition, I finally have the family I always deserved, even if it looks nothing like the family I was born into. So let me ask you something, because I know so many of you watching this have dealt with similar situations in your own families. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and protecting yourself or your children? Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family while someone else was the golden child? How did you handle it? And what did you learn? Drop your stories in the comments below because I genuinely want to hear them, and I think we can all learn from each other's experiences. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already because I'll be sharing more real stories about family dynamics and standing up for yourself and breaking toxic cycles. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this community where we can talk honestly about the hard stuff that families don't always want to admit happens. I'm sending so much love to anyone out there who's struggling with family issues right now. Remember that you deserve respect and fairness and love, and it's not selfish to protect yourself and your kids from people who refuse to give you those things, even if those people are related to you. Stay strong, set those boundaries, and know that you're not alone.